Hello, everybody, and welcome to Futures Leaders Unplugged. In this episode, we will be looking at the Brazilian Revolution. We'll be doing this in a two-part series, and this would be the first part. Brazil's independence story isn't just a political event, it's a sweeping drama filled with exiled kings, rebellious poets, and the prince who stood at the crossroads and chose a new nation over his old empire. Today we step into the streets of colonial Brazil, the halls of Portuguese royal courts, and the banks of the Iparanga River to witness the birth of a great country. This cinematic story will show us how Brazil became independent. The story of Brazilians' fight for independence begins in the late 1700s in what is now the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais, when dusty gold mining towns and covered into rugged hills, where wealth and poverty lived side by side, in lit taverns lit by flickering candles, intellectuals, soldiers, and poets whispered dangerous ideas. They were inspired by Enlightenment, by the American Revolution, by the belief that people could govern themselves. Among them was Tiradentes, a dentist turned revolutionary with fiery conviction. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't powerful, but he believed Brazil deserved independence. When the Inconfidencia Mineira was discovered, the conspirators were crushed. This Tiradentes was executed publicly and brutally, his body displayed as a warning. But instead of fear, his death lit a candle of what would lead to the story of the birth of a great nation. Now we jump ahead all the way to 1907 in Portugal during the Napoleonic Wars. In this time, Napoleon's army was sweeping across the continent like a storm. Portugal was next. But in order to save Portugal and avoid being captured by the French, the Portuguese family did something unprecedented. They fled Portugal. Under the protection of the British Navy and the entire royal court, noble servants, archives, treasures sailed across the Atlantic to the shores of what was then the colony of Brazil. After months of sea, they arrived at Rio de Janeiro, transforming what was then a colonial port until the bustling capital of a global Portuguese empire. This move was unprecedented because it was not often that the kings and queens of a large country would go over to their colony and decide to set up a new base there. In this time, the city exploded, it became the center of the Portuguese Empire. Streets were widened to make room for royal carriages, printing presses hummed for the first time, universities, libraries, academies began to rise from nothing, and merchants flooded the ports with goods from all over the world. Brazil was no longer a distant colony. It became the center of the Portuguese world. By 1915, after the Napoleonic Wars, the king of Portugal decided not to return to Portugal, but instead he decided to turn the Portuguese Empire into the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. This made Brazil equal to Portugal, a constituent country run by a king who would be the king of Brazil, the king of Portugal, and the king of the Algarves at the same time. But this balance did not last. The noble people back in Lisbon did not like this. They did not want Brazil, their colony, to gain power. They did not like the fact that Brazil, their colony, was being put at such a high point, and they wanted the king and his family to return to the shores of Lisbon. So, King João VI was left with no choice. He returned to Portugal in 1821, and he left his son, Prince Pedro, behind as his regent. When he returned to Portugal, The politicians of Lisboa wanted to strip Brazil of its new rights and make it back into a colony. But the Brazilian elites who were now accustomed to this new prosperity, they refused. They would not let this happen. They would not let their home that was bolstered into this new place of importance be returned to just a puny colony. So they rallied behind Prince Pedro, urging him to stay. Over time, these tensions continued to boil over, with the distance between Portugal and Brazil growing farther and farther day by day. It was known that at some point there would have to be a major change on this. So, on the morning of January 9th, 1822, crowds gathered outside the royal palace of Rio. Merchants, soldiers, farmers, freedmen, all waiting for Pedro to make a decision. When he stops out to the balcony, the air is electric. He declares, "Eu fico, I'm staying." This crowd erupts. It's at this point that Brazil's independence becomes inevitable, because the Prince of Portugal, who was left as his regent, he just declared that he's not going back to Portugal. He will not let the elite of Lisboa force him out of Brazil. He is going to stay in Brazil, and he is going to make Brazil its own free, independent nation. Throughout the year 1822, tensions begin to spread like wildfire. Portuguese troops clashed with Brazilian militias. Provinces sent letters pledging loyalty to Prince Pedro, and newspapers published fiery editorials calling for freedom. Pedro is no longer just a prince. He is becoming the symbol of a new nation. It all gets to this boiling point on 7th September 1822. At this point, Pedro is traveling near the Iparanga River when a messenger arrives. Breathless, he carrying a letter from Lisbon, demanding that he submits to Portugal's authority, return to Portugal, and leave Brazil to become a puny colony again. As Pedro reads this letter, his face hardens. He draws up his sword, raises it high, and shouts, "Independence or death." This declaration echoes across the valley, and just like that, Brazil is independent. This independence is only as a beginning, because between 1822 and 1824, the new empire of Brazil had to deal with many fights to secure its borders from other nations and suppress regional revolts to ensure that Brazil remained united. However, slowly but surely, foreign nations begin to recognize the independence of Brazil. Eventually, in 1825, Brazil finally gets recognition from Portugal under the Treaty of Rio de Janeiro. In this agreement, Brazil is able to get independence. However, Brazil must pay Portugal a compensation of £2 million. But though they had to pay this debt, one thing still stands. Brazil emerged as the only monarchy in the Americas, a vast unified territory stretching for thousands of miles, and a nation built on plantations, slavery, and deep regional divides. As Pedro sits on his throne, now as the Emperor of Brazil, the challenges ahead are immense. The empire he founded will face decades of turmoil and eventually will cease to exist. But that is a story for another video. And that is the cinematic story of how Brazil won its independence. A revolution shaped not too much by chaos, but by politics, drama, courage, and a prince who chose Brazil over Portugal. In the next video, we will explore the rise and fall of the Brazilian Empire from Pedro I's troubled reign to Pedro II's golden age and the final collapse of the monarchy in 1889. Thanks for watching, and subscribe as not to miss out on part 2.